Hi there, I'm Jim Brayshaw. I'm author of Imagine No Satan series, a 4-volume book series that dives really deep into who and what Satan is, what hell is, what devils, demons, evil are, and I'd love you to email me if you'd like a PDF copy of volume 1. Today we're not talking so much about Satan as we're talking about where Jesus went when he went to hell. It's interesting to find in 1 Peter 3:18, for Christ has also once suffered for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but quickened by the Spirit, by which also he went and preached to the spirits in prison, where that passage in Peter talks about when Jesus supposedly died and went to hell. And that's interpreted, if we look at the Apostolic Creed, we look at that interpretation and it's brought into the creed that says we believe Jesus descended to hell and ascended to heaven when he was dead for those 3 days. And the creed goes on to interpret it that he suffered the wrath of God for the sins of mankind in this hell, and then redeemed and released people from that prison. The word in the passage says prison, so the prison is presumed to be hell, and he supposedly released them and brought them back up out of the grave, the depths, Sheol, hell, torturous, and he now brought them into heaven, into the realm of the glory of God. So that's what we're talking about today. But what did Jesus really do? Did he really go into hell? Did he descend to the depth of torture that is often thought about? Would it not be possible that hell could be something different than we've seen it to be? And we're going to talk about that for a bit today. So let's just go forward with our discussion and talk first about this. Talk about, if we want to understand where Jesus went when he went to hell, we need to understand what hell is. Hell is now known to be a place of eternal torment and suffering for people all over the world, for people who have died, for all of history. It's thought to be, but what is it? Is it actually that? Is hell, Sheol, Gehenna, Tartarus, Hades, are they all the same thing? Well, in fact, they are. And we find when we look at those items together, they can all be seen under the same framework as Sheol. And we're going to talk about what Sheol is in a little bit. We know the fact that Sheol, Gehenna, Hades, Tartarus, and hell were used all throughout the Bible, the Old Testament, the New Testament. Now, some of them aren't used in the New Testament, like Gehenna, for instance, and Hades. Those are Greek terms. But Sheol itself is a Hebrew term. And what does it mean? Sheol simply means this, folks. Sheol just means buried in the earth or buried in a pit. Often we hear of hell being spoken of as a deep pit or a dark pit. And we know those 5 terms, when we take them collectively and understand the origin of the word Sheol, Sheol never was referring to a torturous, fiery underbelly of the earth where Satan torments the wicked. And we now know better because looking at the ancient histories of hell, we can see quite clearly that Sheol itself, whatsoever you find to do, is a passage, is talking about the grave. Whatsoever you find to do it with your might, for there's no work, nor device, nor knowledge, nor wisdom in the grave, which is the hell, which is the pit where you go. Looking further into Sheol, when we reference it as pit or hell or grave, it also references those things in the New Testament. We find the definition of it, the explanation of the grave, which is Sheol, which is hell, which is Hades, which is Gehenna, which is the pit. All of them refer to the same thing. Looking back at that passage, it says, what you ever find to do it with your might. Why? Because when you're dead, there is no work, there's no device, nor knowledge or wisdom in the grave where you go. So that means nothing's going on in that grave, in that hell, in that pit, in that Sheol. And that's from Ecclesiastes. You can find that there and look a little further at it. But what is Gehenna? Why do we see the term Gehenna used regularly all the time? In the New Testament, the Greek word Gehenna, it's translated as hell 11 times, and it's the name of a burning dump. It was thought to be the name of a burning dump outside of Jerusalem, where refuse and dead bodies of criminals were burned. Now, Gehenna is from the valley of Hinnom, and some say that the evidence is not displaying that there was actually a burning garbage pit in there, but it's long been thought and understood that criminals were often thrown onto a fire because that's where they deserved to go. They deserved a burning torture when they're criminals. The Gehenna that we hear of is not referring to a torturous hell where Jesus or Yeshua, whatever we're calling him today, is not the question. And we're not even putting into question what he did as far as being dead or resurrected. In the New Testament, the Greek word Gehenna is translated hell 11 times. So knowing that, we know we can move forward and find that Gehenna can be seen as just the lake of fire. When we hear about the lake of fire in biblical references, hearing about the lake of fire often puts pictures in our minds about people now down in a dark but brilliantly hot place, burning and being tormented and tortured forever. So why would this loving God confine somebody who didn't know about Jesus or the Messiah to a burning torture for all? What reason would this God decide, I'm going to impose upon humans the most intense, profound, deep, blood-curdling torture I can imagine in hell? So that piece of hell, when we refer to it as the lake of fire, is not actually a lake burning with flames that's torturing humans. It is a reference in many aspects to this Gehenna, a burning garbage heap. So the valley of Gehinnom is what was being spoken of there, and it was used in the minds of many to throw criminals in who had been killed, or dead bodies, and they were burnt up in there. What did Christ use this as, though? As a demonstration of destruction. So sinners were not tortured in this Gehenna, the Gehenna, or in hell. They had already been put to death for their crimes, and their dead bodies were burned in the dump. It was thought they'd lost a right to be buried. So these people who were criminals had lost a right to be buried in a regular grave because of their criminal behavior, because of their antisocial behavior. So they were burned up. Burned up like chaff. We see references to the wicked being burned up in the Old Testament as well. So what do? Do we actually perish, or do we go to heaven? Where do these dead people go? Well, we know this, that the dead people itself, for God so loved the world, it says in John 3:16, that he gave his only begotten Son, and whosoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. So there's one side of this. Those who believe in him don't perish. What that tells us is those who believe in him don't perish, mean those who don't believe in him do perish, and perish simply means death. This is what happens when a person dies. They're no longer existing. There's no memory, no work, no thought of them. And we find that no man has ascended to heaven, but he that came down from heaven, even the Son of Man, which is heaven. This is an interesting passage, John 3:13, because it almost tells us that there was one person that was on earth at one time that died and went to heaven, and that could be this Messiah, the Christ, Yeshua, Jesus. But what it is also saying is that no human being is going to heaven. And heaven is a whole nother piece of biblical misunderstanding that we're going to have to unpack at some point together. Let's look at the word Hades for a moment. According to world-renowned Greek scholar A.T. Robertson, Hades is technically the unseen world. The Hebrew Sheol, the land of the departed. And Hades, as we've talked about, is the Greek word, the Greek word for Sheol. Both are hell. Hades, Sheol, or hell. And as we learned, Sheol is just being buried in a pit or a grave. Sheol is being underneath the earth. In fact, Jesus never used the English word hell himself in the New Testament, and he never used any Greek, Hebrew, or Aramaic word meaning what most people believe to be hell. So he never used a word that referenced people being tortured in an eternal, tormenting fire forever. That did not happen. We know for a fact now that the Mesopotamians, this is quite interesting. If we look at the ancient Mesopotamian culture, what did they think? They thought there was two levels of the afterlife. They didn't think of a heaven where people went to. They thought if you were a good person, you got buried in a fairly low level. The low level, meaning not that far below the surface. And then there was a lower pit where all the torment happened, the severe darkness. If we look on the right of your screen, no act of punishment in that level, cut off from the world of the living, unable to hear the living, no light. There was just utter darkness, and it was too cold to rest or sleep. So can you imagine an eternal existence of endless sleeplessness? This is one of the things ancient Mesopotamia thought. And in their thinking, they realized, hey, something has to happen to people, both good and bad, when they die, because you can't be a good person and die and have crappy things happen to you. And if you're a bad person, you should die and have crappy things happen to you. This was their decision based on societal morals and ethics. And in the heightened level, the upper level, that part that was not very deep under the earth, there was no active reward. And they were close to the world of the living. This was an interesting place because what was there is people could hear their relatives when they came to visit. And there was a bit of light, and they actually could receive gifts of food when people brought food. The temperature was just right, and the existence was preserved. So their memory was preserved forever in this thinking in ancient Mesopotamia. That started to feed the Mesopotamian, and then the Persian, and the Greek, and then the Roman, and then the Christian view of what hell was. So back to the lake of fire for just a moment. We want to talk about this. So if hell, we know the word hell is of Teutonic origin, a word that simply means to cover over. If the word hell is used for the Greek word Hades, and if Hades is simply the Greek word for Sheol, and hell is often said to be Gehenna, and Gehenna is reference to a burning heap where criminals were burned, then what does it mean to be tossed in the lake of fire? Well, we concluded that it means simply a person was destroyed. They were burned up. They no longer existed. And that makes it quite simple to understand. When a person was sent to hell or Gehenna or the lake of fire, they just simply ceased existing, stopped breathing. Their living animated form no longer existed in the way that you and I often think it did. And it just means you're dead and you're buried. This is what going to hell, this is what descending to the pit means. This is what going to the grave, this is what going to the lake of fire, to Gehenna, to Hades, to Sheol, the pit, the grave, Gehenna, the lake of fire, Sheol, they all mean going to hell, and going to hell means you're dead and buried. It simply means you no longer exist. You're not breathing or thinking. There's no consciousness, no memory, no thought of them in the grave. So that simple fact is seen in Acts 2, 26 to 32. Look at how this is put. We're talking about David. Now, when we talk about King David, people often think King David must be one of those super characters up in heaven that's helping to administrate the glorious realm because he was so close to God. But we know this about King David. And in Acts 2, 26 to 32, therefore my heart rejoiced and my tongue was glad. Moreover, my flesh shall rest in hope, because you're not going to leave my soul in hell, neither will you suffer your Holy One to see corruption. And then it goes on, men and brethren, let me speak freely to you under the patriarch David. He is dead and buried, and his sepulchre is with us to this day. So what's going on here in Acts? Well, we find this, that the author of Acts is speaking of two things. He's speaking of the Messiah being dead and then being resurrected, but then he's talking about how David's tomb is there with us. We earlier saw no man has ascended to heaven. So David, essentially in the mind of that writer, is just simply dead in his tomb. He's not up in heaven. He's not conscious or alert in any way. He has no animated form to him. And we see as a reference to the Messiah being dead and buried, not going to leave the Holy One to decay or corruption. This is again another reference of how a person being in Sheol, in hell, in the grave, in the pit, is covered over, buried in the earth, and will not be the person who's going to be decaying, but this reference is being resurrected at some point. And the belief of the author was the Messiah was resurrected after 3 days, after being in the tomb for 3 days, in the heart of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. And knowing that there was this living animated human who died, that person's being is a soul. Not talking about an immortal soul doctrine here. The soul is the animated, breathing human being. And that human being went into the pit, the grave, buried in the heart of the earth. And the book of Acts is quite clear in saying that this Messiah, therefore being by the right hand of God exalted and having received of the Father the promise of the Holy Ghost, he shed forth this which we now see and hear. For David is not ascended to the heavens, but he saith himself, the Lord said unto my Lord, sit thou at my right hand. So the reference here, we often land on the fact that the passage says Jesus is at the right hand of God. But what we miss is the piece that says David did not ascend to heaven. And knowing David didn't ascend to heaven makes things easier for us to understand that when a person's dead, they are what? They're in the grave, the Sheol, the pit, hell, Hades, Gehenna, the lake of fire. But the dead themselves, where do they go? The dead go to Sheol. If the word is translated into English as hell, pit, grave. Ecclesiastes 9 describes Sheol as a place of unconsciousness. And it says here again, I remind you, for the living No, they will die, but the dead know nothing. They have no more reward, for the memory of them is forgotten. Also their love and their hatred and their envy is now perished. Neither have they any more a portion forever in anything that is done under the sun. Go your way, eat your bread with joy and drink for wine with a merry heart, for God now accepts your work. God now accepts your work. And then we find King David here is lamenting in this passage, lamenting that death extinguishes a relationship with God. For in death there's no remembrance of you in the grave. Who will give you thanks? We see that the writer there is talking about how relationship ends when a person's dead. There's no thought, no constructive breathing, no cell regeneration, nothing occurring when a person's dead. They're in the grave, and that is all that is going on for them. And is this what happened with the Yeshua as well? Jesus, when he was in the grave? Very likely, he simply was just dead for 3 days. Again, we're not going to talk about whether or not this Jesus character actually died in a literal clinical death and was resurrected. But we do want to talk about what the message is when we say he descended to hell. He actually descended to a place under the earth where he was dead, buried. I will be in the heart of the earth 3 days and 3 nights. And when the speaker knew what the hell they were talking about in both the Old and New Testament, in Jonah, for instance, we see, I cried because of my affliction unto the Lord, and he heard me out of the belly of hell, Sheol. So they were in Sheol. They were in a dead place, not in a tormentuous place. In Deuteronomy 32, for a fire is kindled in my anger and shall burn into the lowest hell. Now this one's interesting because there were two different concepts of hell that ran through the ranks of the ancient Hebrew people, the ancient Aramaic people. And one of them was there's a gentle hell, and then there's a lower hell, which is a lot more difficult, which is a reference to people who deserve destruction from the presence of the Creator forever. Let's look a bit further at some of these ones. In 1 Corinthians, we see, O death, where is your sting? O grave, where is your victory? So here's a reference to an eventual resurrection that's going to take place, where death and the grave don't keep somebody buried under the earth, but in fact, if the Creator can create a person from the dust of the earth, perhaps the Creator can resurrect a person, is kind of the thinking of the Corinthian author. Genesis says, and all his sons and daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, for I will go down to the grave unto my mourning. So if we look at that passage, and we're going to stop looking at that list now, but if that individual says, I'm going to go down to the grave, the word there is Sheol. That individual who's speaking knew they were going to die and be buried in the earth. They weren't thinking they're going to go down to hell, because if we see the word Sheol referencing the word hell in the future, in the later Old Testament era and in the New Testament era, hell is a word that comes from Sheol. Hades is an ancient concept of a Greek god that was referencing when people were destroyed after they died. These are all important things to remember. And we do know this, that the dead, where are they? You can ask them, but you're not going to hear because they're sleeping. This is another way that being dead is referred to in the New Testament. 1 Corinthians says, and that he was seen of Cephas, then of the 12. After that he was seen of about 500 brethren, at once of whom the greater part remain unto this present. But some are fallen asleep. After that he was seen of James, then of the apostles. So quickly at that passage here, they've fallen asleep. Again, another reference to a person is dead. Like Yeshua, Jesus was asleep in the grave. He was in the heart of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. He was in Sheol. He was in hell. He was in the grave, the pit. Pick the words you want. They all mean he was dead. They all mean what we're seeing here, that the sleep means death. It doesn't mean extra level of consciousness once somebody's physical life on earth stops. In 1 Thessalonians we see, but I would not have you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning those who are asleep, that you sorrow not, even as others which have no hope. For if we believe Jesus died and rose again, even so them also which sleep in Jesus will God bring with him. So another look at people who are dead, asleep in Jesus. They're not alive. They're not in some limbo state. They're not breathing or thinking or anything. They simply are dead. And this author talks about eventually they can get woken up or resurrected again. Here's a few more thoughts on sleeping is dead. In John, these things said he, And after that he said unto them, Our friend Lazarus sleepeth, but I go that I may wake him out of sleep. So sleep is referring to death, not another super conscious state from actually having the physical being stopped and some immortal soul continuing on. Then said his disciple, But if he sleep, he shall do well. And howbeit Jesus spoke of his death, but they thought that he had spoken of taking of rest in sleep. Then said Jesus unto them plainly, Lazarus is dead. So he gave it to them clearly there. He said, you know what? Okay, Lazarus is sleeping. I'm going to go wake him. But, oh, good. He's asleep, the apostle said. And then the Messiah clarified, you know what? He's dead, you guys. But I have the power to resurrect him. Whether that be the case or not, we'll have to find out in a future part of our own journey. But for now, the point is, what is being in hell? What is being in the grave, in the pit, in Sheol? And then in 1 Corinthians 15, Behold, I show you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. And knowing that Paul was supposedly author of this passage in 1 Corinthians, he believed people would die, but not all of us would die. Meaning at some point in his belief, there would be a future dissension from the throne of the Messiah, and those who are alive and remain will be changed. So we're all going to be changed. But the point of it all is that the death to Paul, the death to Yeshua, the death to the apostles, the death to the ancient Hebrews meant somebody was buried under the earth in Sheol. It's just that simple. So I am glad you took this time. It's a lot of your time you put into this, and I went through things quite quickly. You can read all about it in the Imagine No Satan series, or please review some of the material on my website, imaginenosatan.com, and I would be happy to field your emails or questions anytime at Brayshaw@shaw.ca. And it's been great to have this time with you. I'll look forward to seeing you again soon. And please remember this, that when Jesus went to hell, he was dead and buried in the grave. That's all hell meant. He didn't descend to the lower depths where there's a furnace, a lake of fire, burning and causing torment to people. Jesus himself, Yeshua himself, the Messiah himself, spent time in that non-conscious state, according to the message we're getting by the language in the Bible, both the Old and New Testament. And then eventually his animated form returned, because the word soul itself is a topic for another conversation, but I'll give you this piece right now. The word soul is from the ancient Hebrew nephesh, and it simply means the animated, breathing being. Both humans and animals are a living soul whenever we're breathing. So I'm glad to know you, as a living soul, took time to be with me. I'm Jim Brayshaw, and I'll look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks so much.